This research proposes a novel framework for investigating the intersection of Jungian archetypes and other unconscious symbols with AI systems. By mapping Jungian symbols into high-dimensional conceptual spaces, we can identify potential homomorphisms with latent spaces of LLMs. If such structural correspondences exist, they may reveal traces of the collective unconscious embedded within AI's internal representations. The central premise of this presentation is that the symbols of the human unconscious, which can be observed in our cultural myths and societal narratives, can be mapped into higher dimensional spaces using a framework from cognitive sciences called conceptual spaces. I'm then proposing we can compare the abstract structures of AI's higher dimensional computing space with the abstract structures in which these unconscious symbols can be represented in conceptual spaces. If such similarities can be found, it's possible, as I will speculate, that AI's inner representations reflect the unconscious representations within the human mind. While my presentation will focus primarily on Jung's view of the unconscious, the underlying proposal that certain symbols may represent unconscious thoughts is consistent with other, more mainstream views of the mind. I'm primarily focusing on Jung's view of the unconscious as it provides a more robust framework for detailing how external narratives and collective cultural myths may have the capacity to reflect our unconscious personal and collective trauma. In Jungian depth psychology, the unconscious mind is paradoxical. It operates essentially outside of space and time and logic. And it's because of these reasons that it uses symbols to make itself known to the conscious mind. So the unconscious mind is paradoxical and it cannot be understood directly by the conscious mind or the ego, which understands things in terms of rationality and logic. Jung classes 12 main archetypes as the foundational symbols that other symbols belong to. For example, the mother archetype symbolizes nature and caring, and other everyday objects may be symbols that belong to this archetype, such as the earth, the womb, or family heirlooms. According to Jung, these archetypes are the structural elements of the unconscious mind, and they are revealed in a sequential manner in the development of a healthy consciousness. Jung's archetypes are not just theoretical and are applied in the modern world in various fields. For example, advertisers use them to appeal to their target audience's unconscious mind to create an emotional connection to the product. And Jung's archetypes are the basis for the storytelling template that Hollywood uses called the hero's journey. And the archetypes are also seen in all the great myths across different cultures in human history. Joseph Campbell's work on mythology significantly inspired the concept of the hero's journey, illustrating how different cultures, despite having no contact with each other, constructed myths that employed similar archetypes and followed similar structures. This serves as partial evidence for Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious, which posits that humans possess both a personal unconscious and a shared collective unconscious. The structural elements of both the collective and personal unconscious are represented by Jung's archetypes. We can observe traces of these archetypes in cultural mythology and societal narratives in our collective conscious, as well as in our dreams and personal stories in our own individual unconscious. One profound aspect of the hero's journey is that from a Jungian perspective, it's a metaphor for the unconscious mind. Because the archetypes in Jung's depth psychology are the basic structural elements of the unconscious. And the stages of the hero's journey are also archetypal. This means the hero's journey reflects the deep structure of our inner mind. The hero's journey is the perfect framework to quickly demonstrate how our unconscious trauma manifests in narratives. Because the hero's journey, while it is a storytelling template which depicts a protagonist starting off in the known world and entering the unknown world, is actually a metaphor for our own journey into the unconscious mind. The protagonist represents our ego, and the protagonist who embarks on the journey must ultimately face the abyss, which symbolizes our repressed trauma. The challenges the protagonist meets on the way symbolize our self-defense mechanisms that we have to protect us from our repressed trauma. In this way, we understand that the personal narratives that we tell ourselves and the world, and also our collective narratives, reflect our personal trauma and our collective trauma. I'll now move on to how we can represent Jung's archetypes as well as our unconscious trauma using the mathematical framework called conceptual spaces. In conceptual spaces, a framework often used in cognitive sciences and AI, objects are represented as vectors in higher dimensional spaces, where each dimension corresponds to a specific attribute or feature, such as color, shape, or size in the case of apples. This structured geometric representation allows us to compare objects based on their feature vectors. Closer vectors indicate more similar concepts. Furthermore, these representations can be refined by subdividing attributes into more detailed, fine-grained features. For example, a broad attribute like color can be further broken down into hue, saturation, and brightness, adding more dimensions to capture subtle variations. An intuitive and simple way to visualize how concepts are broken down and mapped into high dimensional spaces is through looking at a classification chart, such as the animal kingdom. The parent node represents the main concept. Then we divide the main concept up into subconcepts, and the decisions we make on how to divide the concept into subclasses become the new dimensions of the feature space. As we continue refining and subdividing, each decision adds more dimensions, creating a more detailed, multi-layered representation of the original concept in a higher dimensional space. It's natural to wonder whether or not there's a limit to how far we can continue to subdivide our dimensions into more refined attributes. Theoretically, we could continue the process until we could no longer meaningfully label the dimensions. At this point, we can only represent the concept in terms of abstract geometries. Now, in order to deepen the framework in this presentation, I'm going to borrow a technique from data visualization called the kernel trick. Applying the kernel trick to conceptual spaces enables us to represent concepts in a higher dimensional abstract space without explicitly calculating the coordinates or even labeling each dimension. Instead, it allows us to operate implicitly within that space by computing inner products between data points, thereby efficiently handling complex non-linear relationships without the need for direct mapping or detailed dimensional labeling. Up until this point, I've now given a framework for how objects as concepts can be mapped into higher dimensional spaces and how we can apply the kernel trick to conceptual spaces to map these conceptual objects into abstract spaces where we don't need to implicitly know the coordinates or the dimensions or be able to label the dimensions. The next step now is to take Jung's symbols and drop them into this conceptual space framework. So now we have a framework for taking Jung's symbols and mapping them through conceptual spaces into high dimensional spaces. We can then apply the kernel trick in turn to Jung's symbols. So we take the original symbol as a concept and map it into a higher dimensional abstract space where we don't need to implicitly know the coordinates or the dimensions. In this purely abstract realm, the symbols of the unconscious take on higher dimensional structures that we can speculatively model to compare with the higher dimensional structures where AI makes its computations. In summary, the computing space of large language models and AI has a mathematical structure. I'm proposing that unconscious symbols can be modeled using similar mathematical structures, and the payoff for this is we can search for isomorphisms, homomorphisms, and other structural preservations between the inner space of AI and the inner space of the human mind, allowing us to screen for unconscious messages such as trauma. In large language models, words or tokens are embedded in higher dimensional spaces. This involves mapping them into vectors that capture semantic relationships between words. The high dimensional space allows the model to represent complex patterns and relationships in the data. Now, while there are similarities with conceptual spaces in the kernel trick, it will be challenging to create a model to search for mappings between these two spaces. What I've presented is just a theoretical framework for future exploration to investigate these topics, but finding homomorphisms requires establishing a structure-preserving map between the spaces. This involves not only matching structures, but ensuring that operations or transformations in one space reflect in the other. This is going to be extremely complex due to the nonlinear transformations within LLM systems. However, I hope that I've put forward an interesting idea for how, if these challenges can be overcome, we can begin to search for traces of the collective unconscious from a structural and abstract point of view within AI systems.